The ocean at night does not forgive scale. On paper, an aircraft carrier was a moving city. Steel decks longer than city blocks, thousands of men, radios, radar, machine shops, bakeries. A floating airfield that could project power across hundreds of miles. It was designed to be untouchable, shielded by destroyers, screened by cruisers, wrapped in doctrine that promised early warning and layered defense. Yet after sunset, those same ships became some of the most vulnerable structures ever built for war. Not because they were weak, because they were visible, audible, predictable, and because darkness did not erase them, it erased their advantages. Men who survived those nights did not speak first about explosions. They spoke about waiting, about the feeling that the ocean itself had become an enemy surface, flat and unknowable, where death could travel unseen for hours before arriving all at once. They spoke about the silence that preceded violence, a silence so complete that the heartbeat became audible. During the early years of the Pacific War, aircraft carriers were still a theory being tested in real time. Naval planners had imagined decisive daylight battles, fleets maneuvering for position, scout planes ranging wide, air groups striking from over the horizon. Carriers were meant to see first, strike first, and never allow the enemy to close. The admirals who designed these doctrines had studied Jutland and Trafalgar. They understood gunnery and formation, but they were building strategies for a weapon that had never been tested in sustained combat. The carrier was a promise written in blueprints and war games, not blood. But doctrine had a blind side. Most carrier defense was built around visibility, spotting aircraft, tracking radar returns, vectoring fighters. Darkness reduced that entire system to fragments. Radar in the early 1940s was imperfect, cluttered by waves, limited by interpretation. Sound carried differently at sea. Distances felt shorter. Bearings felt uncertain. The radar operators who sat before those early scopes understood their instruments' limitations intimately. A flock of birds could create a false alarm. A temperature inversion could bend signals. The technology that promised omniscience delivered instead a murky, uncertain picture that demanded human judgment under impossible pressure. A carrier group at night was a machine designed for daylight, forced to operate inside an environment that stripped away its senses. Navigation itself became an exercise in controlled anxiety. Ships steamed in blackout conditions, no running lights, no deck illumination beyond what was absolutely necessary. The ocean swallowed shapes. A destroyer's silhouette could disappear against the horizon only a few thousand yards away. Formation keeping required trust in instruments and the judgment of tired men staring at dim scopes. Helmsmen who guided these vessels spoke of the peculiar terror of steering through darkness, surrounded by friendly ships. Each vessel displaced thousands of tons. Each moved at speeds that made collision avoidance measured in seconds. The margin between safety and catastrophe was a compass bearing, a throttle setting, a moment of inattention. Doctrine said dispersion reduced vulnerability. Reality meant ships could lose contact with each other in darkness. Close formation improved mutual defense. Reality meant the risk of collision. Steel hulls moving at over 20 knots, separated by guesses. Every choice traded one danger for another. Commanders weighed probabilities that could not be calculated, made decisions that would only be proven right or wrong by sunrise. Inside the carrier, the flight deck that defined its purpose became a liability. It was a vast, flat surface, vulnerable to fire. Aviation fuel lines ran beneath it. Ordnance was staged nearby. Aircraft, fragile and flammable, were lashed down in rows. During the day, that deck was controlled chaos. At night, it was a place of shadows and muffled orders. The men who worked that deck knew its geography by memory and muscle. They moved between aircraft by touch, knowing that a misstep could mean falling into a propeller arc or tumbling over the edge into black water. The deck was their workplace and their potential grave, separated by inches and attention. The doctrine assumed aircraft would be recovered before full darkness, decks secured, damage control ready. But war did not respect schedules. Late strikes returned, weather delayed landings, planes low on fuel approached ships that could not afford to light up. Some crews described the landing signal officers as ghostly figures, paddles glowing faintly, guiding pilots down toward a deck they could barely see. A mistake meant not just one aircraft lost, but fire. And fire at sea spreads faster than fear. Every landing was an act of faith performed by exhausted men in machines that had been pushed to their limits. Below deck, men slept in shifts beside aviation gasoline tanks, magazines, boiler rooms. The carrier was not a hollow hull. It was layered with risk, compartmentalized by design, yet connected by ventilation, wiring, and human movement. A single hit could turn design into a pathway. The sailors who bunked in these spaces learned to sleep through noise, but wake at any change in rhythm. The steady thrum of engines became a lullaby. Its interruption became an alarm more effective than any klaxon. Meanwhile, beyond the task force perimeter, submarines hunted. Night erased the advantage of air patrols. Anti-submarine aircraft that ranged far during daylight were grounded or limited. Surface escorts relied on sonar and radar, tools that could be fooled by thermoclines, sea state, operator fatigue. A submarine commander needed only a silhouette and patience. For the submariners, the carrier was both prize and threat. Its escorts were deadly. Depth charges and hedgehogs could tear a hull apart, but the carrier's size made it detectable. Its speed meant predictable routes. Its operational patterns, launch, recover, refuel, created rhythms. The submarine crews who stalked these task forces lived in conditions that surface sailors could barely imagine. Cramped, humid, stinking of diesel and sweat, they waited for opportunities measured in minutes after days of approach. Their world was one of patience punctuated by violence. One Japanese submarine officer later wrote that at night the ocean felt compressed, as if distances shrank and opportunity condensed into brief windows. He described watching a task force through his periscope at dusk, the carrier's outline like a low island against a fading sky. He knew that if he attacked, the counterattack might kill him. He also knew that letting such a target pass felt like failing the war itself. Inside the carrier's combat information center, men leaned over radar scopes glowing green. Contacts appeared and vanished. Some were squalls, some were birds, some were aircraft at the edge of detection. Each blip demanded interpretation. To overreact meant exhausting crews and launching fighters into darkness. To underreact meant surprise. The atmosphere in these spaces was one of controlled tension. Voices stayed low and professional. Coffee grew cold in cups that hands forgot to lift. Eyes ached from staring at phosphorescent screens. The responsibility of interpretation weighed on young men who understood that their judgment might determine whether thousands lived or died. Training emphasized procedure, plot, confirm, report. But fatigue blurred procedure into habit. Coffee cups cooled beside consoles. Voices over intercom circuits became flat, professional, controlled. The tone of men trying not to imagine what might already be inbound. Night attacks, when they came, did not announce themselves like daytime raids. No distant glints of sunlight on wings, no growing formations. Sometimes only a sudden radar contact at close range, altitude uncertain. Searchlights risked revealing the ship. Tracers arced into darkness with no clear target. The transition from waiting to violence happened without warning. One moment, the ship hummed with routine tension. The next, general quarters sounded, and men ran to stations through passageways they had memorized for exactly this purpose. Pilots who flew those missions from the attacking side often described disorientation. One American aviator recalled looking down at what he thought was empty ocean, then seeing the rectangular shadow of a carrier only when flak began rising toward him. "It was like the sea opened," he said. He dropped his bombs by instruments and instinct, unsure if he hit anything, then flew back over water that gave no reference, only blackness. For the defenders, anti-aircraft fire at night was an act of faith. Gunners fired at bearings and altitudes fed to them seconds before. The concussion of their own guns shook the deck. Shell casings clattered. The sky showed brief orange blossoms where fuses detonated, then returned to void. Every round fired upward risked falling back. Fragments rained onto decks already crowded with equipment and men. Friendly fire injuries were not uncommon. Effectiveness had a cost measured not just in ammunition, but in nerves and accidents. Then there were the torpedoes. A torpedo at night was almost theoretical until it wasn't. No wake visible in the dark. Sometimes a lookout would shout at the last moment, having caught a pale line in phosphorescence. Often there was only impact. A deep, blunt force that seemed to lift the ship sideways. The physics of such impacts defied intuition. Thousands of tons of steel moved by a single explosion. Decks buckled, bulkheads bent. The ship that had been a stable world became suddenly uncertain, tilted, wrong. Survivors of such hits rarely remembered the explosion first. They remembered the change in motion, the deck tilting slightly, the sound of machinery faltering, then alarms, red lights, watertight doors slamming. Damage control doctrine was precise. Isolate compartments, counterflood, fight fires. But at night, in red-lit passages, with smoke and the smell of fuel, maps of the ship lived only in memory. Men moved by touch, by shouted directions, by the feel of heat through steel. One machinist's mate described carrying a hose through a corridor where the deck was slick. He could not tell if it was water or oil. He could not see more than a few feet ahead. He remembered thinking, irrationally, that the ship had become a cave, and that the ocean was pressing in from all sides. These men fought battles that would never appear in official histories. They wrestled with valves that refused to turn. They pulled wounded comrades through spaces too small for stretchers. They made decisions about which compartments to seal, knowing that sealing meant condemning. On the attacking submarines, crews listened for the result. The distant thud transmitted through water, then screws changing pitch, escorts accelerating. The hunter became the hunted. Depth charges rolled off rails, entered the sea, and seconds later turned water into a hammer. A submarine hull under depth charge attack flexed. Lights flickered, gauges rattled. Men held onto pipes and prayed silently. The success of the attack above meant an increased chance of death below. Effectiveness carried its own echo. Carriers also carried their own dangers internally. To maximize sortie rates, aviation fuel lines were often pressurized. Ordnance was staged for quick rearming. In theory, this readiness meant power. In practice, after a hit, it meant fire could find fuel easily. Fire at sea is not like fire on land. There is no outside. Heat builds, smoke fills compartments, ventilation spreads it. Damage control parties wore masks that limited vision and air. They crawled through spaces where metal was hot enough to burn through gloves. The chemistry of burning aviation fuel created temperatures that melted steel and consumed oxygen. Men who fought these fires described a kind of intimate combat, wrestling an enemy that could not be seen clearly, could not be reasoned with, could only be contained or escaped. Some men fought fires for hours, unaware of the overall tactical picture, whether the ship was still under attack, whether help was near. Their world was reduced to hoses, valves, and the discipline of not running when instinct said run. Above them, flight deck crews sometimes continued working in partial darkness, moving aircraft away from damage, jettisoning munitions overboard, pushing burning planes toward the edge. A burning aircraft sliding across steel in darkness was a moving threat, its fuel trailing fire. Attackers, too, paid in confusion. Night navigation over open ocean, limited radio, fear of getting lost. Pilots who missed their carrier on return sometimes had nowhere to land. Some ditched in darkness, trusting that someone might see a flare. Many were never found. The ocean that had seemed like a highway during the day became a maze at night. Stars that should have guided became obscured by clouds. Instruments that should have informed became unreliable through damage or exhaustion. Doctrine had promised coordination. Night fractured it. Individual crews, individual compartments, individual submarines and destroyers were left to solve immediate problems with incomplete information. Even escorting destroyers, built for speed and aggression, felt exposed. Their role was to screen, to intercept threats before they reached the carrier. At night, they sprinted towards sonar contacts that might be false, dropping patterns of explosives into water that hid both enemy and ally. One destroyer sailor wrote of staring into the Black Sea after an attack, convinced he saw shapes moving just below the surface, submarines, wreckage, bodies, but never certain. Fatigue blurred perception. The mind supplied threats where sensors were silent. The carrier itself, once damaged, could become a beacon. Fires glowed. Smoke rose, visible against stars. Rescue ships approached, increasing the number of targets. The imperative to save lives pulled vessels into risk envelopes they would otherwise avoid. Captains faced impossible arithmetic. How many to risk to save how many? How long to search before withdrawal became necessary? These calculations had no correct answers, only consequences that would be judged by history and memory. Men abandoning ship at night entered water that was colder than expected, darker than imagined. The hull that had been their world receded, lights flickering, metal groaning. Some clung to debris, some listened to distant gunfire or explosions, unable to see their source. Rescue in darkness was imperfect. Searchlights scanned waves, illuminating faces for a second before moving on. Whistles and shouts carried, then were lost in wind. Those in the water described the strange intimacy of floating beside strangers, both reduced to voices in the dark. The hierarchy that had ordered shipboard life dissolved in the water. Officers and enlisted men became simply survivors, sharing whatever floated, calling out to maintain contact, watching for the lights of rescue vessels that might or might not come. On surviving carriers, the psychological weight lingered. Sailors returned to bunks near compartments where friends had been. The ship sailed on, repairs ongoing, air operations resuming. War did not pause for mourning. The rhythm of operations continued because it had to. Aircraft launched, watches rotated, meals were served, but something had changed in the men who had seen the night turn violent. They moved differently, watched more carefully, startled more easily. Official reports spoke of tonnage, sorties, enemy losses. They cataloged damage in percentages and timelines. They did not record the moment when a sailor hesitated before closing a watertight door, knowing someone might be on the other side. The bureaucracy of war demanded quantification. Numbers could be analyzed, compared, used to plan future operations. The immeasurable costs, the broken sleep, the persistent dread, the faces that appeared unbidden in memory, found no column in the reports. Aircraft carriers did not become floating coffins because they were poorly designed. They became so at night because their design concentrated men, fuel, explosives, and purpose into a single platform that depended on sight and coordination. Darkness attacked those dependencies directly. Every improvement, faster refueling, more aircraft, tighter formations, aggressive operations, increased effectiveness and risk together. The same systems that allowed carriers to dominate daylight battles made nighttime damage more catastrophic. There were no villains in those steel corridors. Submariners followed orders written in distant offices. Damage control teams obeyed drills practiced in calm harbors. Pilots flew toward dim outlines because turning back meant failing comrades. Each man in the chain believed in duty, in nation, in the cause that had brought them to this dark water. They were enemies by circumstance, linked by the shared experience of fear and courage that only those who have faced death at sea can understand. The ocean accepted all of it without judgment. Years later, survivors described dreams not of combat, but of drifting, of being on a deck at night, unable to find a ladder or a door, of hearing machinery that would not start, of looking out over black water and feeling that something immense and patient was moving just beyond sight. These dreams persisted for decades, emerging on quiet nights when sleep became permeable. The mind returned to those hours with a fidelity that waking memory could not match. Carriers continued to sail, technology improved, radar sharpened, procedures evolved, but the memory of those early nights remained embedded in naval thinking, a quiet acknowledgement that scale and power do not erase vulnerability, they reshape it. In the end, the ships that survived carried their scars in patched decks and replaced bulkheads. The men carried theirs in silences, in the way they paused at sudden loud sounds, in the way they watched dark water longer than necessary. Victory at sea was measured in maps and treaties, but for many who stood watch on carrier decks after sunset, the war narrowed to a simple private hope, that this night at least, the ocean would remain only water and not a doorway through which everything could be lost.